The rain had been falling since dusk, heavy enough to blur the orange halo of the street lamps outside the Whitmore residence. The wind moaned low through the sycamores, carrying the occasional snap of a branch. Inside, the house was quiet too. Quiet for a place where two children should have been playing before bedtime. Sarah Whitmore stood in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she clutched the phone. The digital clock on the microwave read 9:42 p.m. She had been pacing between the living room and kitchen for the last 15 minutes, listening. There it was again, a creak, faint, deliberate. Not the sound of settling wood or the groan of old pipes, but the slow compression of a floorboard beneath human weight. She pressed the numbers on the phone with deliberate precision, trying to keep her breathing. Even the rain on the windows masked the sound of her own heartbeat. When the dispatcher's voice came through the receiver, Sarah's relief cracked her composure. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's in the house, she whispered. I think he's been here before. Ma'am, is this person inside your home right now? Sarah's eyes darted to the shadowy hallway that led toward the bedrooms. The children were upstairs. Daniel was in the garage, or so she thought. Yes, she breathed, barely audible. He's upstairs. I can hear him. Stay on the line. Police are on the way. Can you lock yourself in a room? She moved toward the pantry, the nearest door with a lock, but hesitated. You don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. Now, he's been here before, I told Daniel. I told him last week. The back door was open then too. Ma'am, who do you believe this person is? Sarah's reply caught in her throat. She wanted to say the name Carl, but something in her stopped. She glanced at the staircase, the landing swallowed in darkness. I don't know. She lied. Just hurry. Stay calm, ma'am, the sound interrupted her. A soft thud from upstairs, then the slow slide of something heavy across the floor. Her eyes widened. I have to get my kids, she said suddenly, the panic breaking through. Ma'am, stay where you are, the line crackled. Sarah's breath hitched, and then there was a muffled voice, a man's in the background. Too far for the dispatcher to make out. Sarah, the voice came from the darkness at the top of the stairs. Her grip on the phone tightened. Daniel? She asked. Unsure, no answer. Just the steady rhythm of footsteps descending. Ma'am, are you safe? Ma'am, the dispatcher's voice rose. Urgent now. The footsteps stopped halfway down the staircase. Sarah backed toward the kitchen door, her sock catching on the edge of the tile. Who's there? She demanded, her voice breaking between fear and defiance. Silence, and then a whisper. Not loud enough for words, just the shape of breath moving through the still air. She turned toward the front door. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, rain-slick light spilling in through the glass panels. A shadow passed across that light, as if someone was standing just outside. God, she gasped. Ma'am, listen to me. The police are almost there. Do not hang up. Do not. The dispatcher's voice was cut short by a sharp metallic click. Sarah froze. The sound hadn't come from the phone. It had come from behind her, from the kitchen, where the back door latch was sliding open. Her eyes darted between the front and back of the house. Two directions, two possible exits, two possible dangers. The stairs creaked again. Whoever had been halfway down was now moving faster. She made her choice and bolted for the front door. Rain-laden air rushed in as she swung it open. She took one step onto the porch and stopped. The man standing there was tall, his face obscured by the shadow of the eaves. He didn't move toward her, didn't speak. Just stood, dripping wet, watching Dot. Her voice faltered. Who, behind her, something heavy hit the floor, a dull, wet sound, and the children screamed from upstairs. Sarah spun around. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering against the porch railing. Ma'am, the dispatcher's voice shouted into the void, tinny and far away now. The man on the porch stepped forward, one slow pace. Sarah backed into the doorway, trapped between the stranger outside and whatever horror had just unfolded upstairs. Then the line went dead outside. The rain intensified, drowning the sound of everything else. A neighbor, an insomniac named Lydia. Rose swore later she saw a tall figure leaving the Whitmore porch around 9:50 p.m. But she couldn't be sure if he'd gone inside first. Inside the Whitmore home. The kitchen light flickered once, then went out entirely by the time the first patrol car pulled up. The house was silent. The front door hung slightly ajar, rain pooling on the threshold. Dinner plates sat untouched on the dining table, the steam from the green beans long gone. A half-full glass of red wine remained by Sarah's chair, a faint smudge of lipstick on the rim. Upstairs, the beds were empty, sheets crumpled as though someone had left in haste. A stuffed rabbit lay in the hallway, damp from muddy footprints. That stopped abruptly near the staircase, no sign of the family. No sign of a struggle, except for the phone, still lying on the porch. The last connection Sarah Whitmore ever made to the outside world when Detective Mark Ellison arrived minutes later. He stood in the kitchen doorway, listening to the house, breathed the slow drip of rainwater from the eaves, the groan of the wooden beams in the wind. Something about the air felt wrong, heavy. As if the walls themselves were holding a secret, Ellison looked toward the staircase. The second step from the top was damp, as though someone had stood there with wet shoes recently. The dispatcher's printed call log lay on the counter, the last words underlined in black pen, "He's been here before." Ellison didn't yet know that this would be the sentence that haunted him for the next 12 years. The rain had slowed by the time the first patrol unit pulled up, headlights slicing across the slick pavement. Officer Jenna Morales stepped out, her boots splashing into shallow puddles. She could smell wet leaves, damp earth, the metallic tang of a night gone wrong. The Whitmore house stood with its porch light still on, the front door hanging half open like an unwelcome invitation. From the curb, the scene didn't look violent. No shattered glass, no screaming neighbors. Just stillness, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes your skin crawl. "Dispatch, I'm on scene," Morales said into her radio, doors ajar, no sign of movement. Inside, the air was warm but carried a faint mustiness, as if the house had been holding its breath. The dining table was set for 4. A roast sat in the center, now cold. Its fat congealed under the dim overhead light. A half-empty glass of wine rested beside a plate with a single bite missing. Morales recognized the shade of lipstick on the rim, a detail she'd later note. Though she couldn't yet say why it mattered, she called out into the silence, "Police, is anyone here?" Only the hum of the refrigerator answered her. She moved through the living room first, everything neatly arranged, no overturned furniture, no broken lamps. The television remote sat on the arm of the couch, untouched. The mantel held framed photographs. Sarah holding her daughter at the beach, Daniel coaching his son's Little League game, the family posing in front of a Christmas tree last winter. Nothing about the images hinted at the night's events. From upstairs came the faintest groan, a sound she couldn't place. Morales froze, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. Detective Mark Ellison arrived moments later, stepping past Morales with his usual methodical calm. He took in the scene with slow, deliberate sweeps of his eyes. "Looks like they just walked away," Morales murmured. Ellison glanced toward the staircase. Or were made to. They ascended together. The upstairs hallway smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic, maybe old plumbing, maybe something else. The children's bedrooms were as neat as the downstairs, toys lined up on shelves, pajamas folded on beds. But in the daughter's room, a stuffed rabbit lay on the floor, its fur matted with a dampness that hadn't yet dried. The son's room held a baseball glove on the nightstand, the leather still soft from regular use. In the master bedroom, Sarah's purse sat on the dresser, her wallet and keys inside. Daniel's wristwatch rested beside it, ticking steadily. Ellison leaned over the nightstand, eyes narrowing. "Morales," he said quietly, pointing to a faint trail of muddy smudges along the carpet, leading from the doorway toward the closet. Then, stopping abruptly, they opened the closet. Nothing, just neatly hung clothes. Rows of shoes, the faint scent of cedar from a hanging block. No bodies. No signs of a struggle. Back downstairs, the garage door was closed but unlocked. The family's sedan sat inside, its hood cool to the touch. An umbrella still dripped rainwater near the entryway, suggesting someone had come in not long ago. Ellison frowned. If they left, they didn't take their car, their coats, or their wallets. That doesn't happen. By 10:30 p.m., more units had arrived. Flashlights swept through the backyard, down the alley, across the empty playground, 2 blocks away. The rain had washed away any clear footprints. Neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk. Some wrapped in robes, others holding steaming mugs of tea or coffee. Lydia Rowe, the neighbor who claimed she'd seen a man on the porch, was among them. Ellison approached her gently. "Tell me exactly what you saw tonight." She pulled her cardigan tight against the damp air. It was a man, tall, thin, didn't move like someone local. He just stood there on the porch. Thought it was Daniel at first, but when I looked again, he was gone. Gone where? Ellison asked. She shook her head. I didn't see, just gone. Like he melted into the dark. Another neighbor, Jim Holloway, added something else. This ain't the first time, he said. Past couple weeks, I've seen someone hanging around out back. Thought it was maybe one of the kids' friends cutting through the yard. Guess not. The details were vague, conflicting. No one had a license plate. No one had a clear face. Just whispers of someone watching. By midnight, the search of the house was complete. Nothing was missing. No drawers rifled through. No signs of forced entry. It was as if the Whitmores had evaporated, leaving behind only the residue of a life in progress. Ellison stood in the living room, staring at the family portraits again. He'd been on cases with blood, with chaos, with broken glass and smashed locks. Those made sense. Those had stories that could be reconstructed, but this was different. This was absence shaped like people. As he walked toward the front door, he noticed the smallest thing. The chain lock was unlatched, but hanging twisted, as if it had been swung open quickly. Dispatch, he said into his radio. Start canvassing the area for anyone matching 6-foot male, lean build, dark clothing, possible connection to previous suspicious activity near the residence. Before leaving, he stepped back into the kitchen. The roast still sat there. The wine glass still shimmered faintly under the light. And on the counter beside the sink, a thin ring of water, the size and shape of a drinking glass, that didn't match anything else on the table. Ellison didn't touch it. Didn't need to say in his gut, he knew it didn't belong to the family. The morning after the Whitmores vanished, the rain finally broke. Sunlight fell in thin, reluctant strips across wet pavement, glinting off the yellow police tape strung around. The house. Detective Mark Ellison stood on the front porch, coffee cooling in his hand, scanning the neighborhood like a man trying to read an unfamiliar language. The house behind him felt wrong, too quiet, too intact. The kind of silence that suggested not peace, but the aftermath of something unspoken the night before. He'd written the phrase from Sarah Whitmore's last 911 call in his notebook. He's been here before now. He intended to find out exactly who he was. Ellison started at Lydia Rowe's home, directly across the street. Lydia answered in a faded robe, her hair damp from a hurried shower. You're back early, she said. I'm not finished, Ellison replied. Last night you said you saw a tall man on the porch around 9:50. Tell me more. She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the Whitmore house as if it might overhear. It wasn't the first time, she admitted. I've seen him before, sitting on their steps. At night, always alone, never knocked, never said anything. Ellison's pen moved across his notepad. How many times? 4, maybe 5. Always late. Sometimes when Daniel was home, sometimes not. He'd just sit there, like he was waiting, and you never called. I did, once. By the time police came, he was gone. The next few houses offered variations of the same story. Mrs. Patel, 2 doors down, Said she'd seen a thin white man crouched near the Whitmore's front garden one night, staring toward the door. An older man named Harris claimed the stranger had been there just last Thursday, leaning against the porch post, smoking a cigarette. Could you smell it? Ellison asked. Harris nodded. Cheap brand, real acrid, not something you'd forget. By noon, Ellison had pieced together a disturbing pattern. The stranger appeared without warning, always at night. He never spoke, never knocked, and vanished before anyone could confront him. And there was one more thing. No one had ever seen him arrive or leave. Morales met Ellison back at the house with an update. No prints on the porch railing, doorknob, or steps. And here's the weird part. No footprints in the soil. Rain or no rain, we should have seen something. Ellison studied the porch steps. The wood was damp, but the dirt below showed no disturbance. Either he's careful, or he was never here in the way we think. In the afternoon, Ellison widened the search. A young mother named Erin Carr, who lived in a second-story apartment overlooking the block, had been hesitant to speak the night before. Now, sitting on her couch with her infant on her lap, she seemed ready. I saw him up close once, she said. Maybe 2 weeks ago, I was up late feeding the baby. He came out of the alley, walked right onto the Whitmore's porch, and sat down. Did he see you? Her gaze dropped to the floor. I think so. He looked right up at my window. Just stared, like he was memorizing my face. What did he look like? Mid-40s maybe? Hollow cheeks. Wearing a dark coat, too big for him. His hair looked wet, but it wasn't raining. Ellison's next stop was the corner store, where the Whitmores sometimes shopped. The cashier, a young man with earbuds, draped around his neck, leaned in when asked. Yeah, I've seen him. Comes in late sometimes. Never buys much. Always asks if we sell kerosene. That detail stuck with Ellison. Kerosene. A man sitting silently on the porch. The smell of cheap cigarettes. None of it fit cleanly yet, but it was starting to draw an outline by early evening. Ellison stood on the Whitmore's porch again. The boards groaned softly under his weight. He tried to picture the man sitting here, night after night, watching the door, waiting for something. Why the Whitmores? Why here? The neighborhood was the kind where most people knew each other's names, where strangers stood out. This man hadn't just stood out, he'd left a shadow over the entire street. Mark Morales called from the driveway. She held up a clear evidence bag. Inside was a crushed cigarette butt, damp from last night's rain. Found it in the gutter, she said. Matches Harris's description of the smell. We'll run it for DNA, but Ellison nodded. He didn't. Need her to finish the sentence? Whoever the stranger was, he'd been here recently, maybe even the night of the disappearance. As daylight faded, Ellison lingered on the porch steps. His notebook lay open to a list. Tall, thin male, dark coat, oversized, seen multiple nights, no prints. Number track, smokes cheap cigarettes, asks for kerosene. He closed the notebook slowly, glancing at the empty street. Somewhere out there, the man was still watching. That night, Ellison dreamed of the porch. In the dream, he was the one sitting there, silent, staring at the door. Inside, the Whitmores moved about their lives, unaware of him, until they weren't, when he woke. The taste of smoke lingered in his mouth. The file on Ellison's desk looked ordinary enough, a thin manila folder with Whitmore scrawled across the front. Inside, however, it held something different from police reports and witness statements. A series of photocopied diary pages. They had come from Sarah Whitmore's sister, Emily James, who had appeared at the station just after dawn, clutching a leather-bound book like it was a living thing. She'd refused to hand over the original, but agreed to let Ellison make copies. In the first entry, dated September 8, 2005, Sarah wrote, Daniel isn't himself lately. He's distracted, comes home late, says it's work, but I know it's not. There's something in his eyes, like he's already somewhere else. The handwriting was neat. Careful, as if each word had been weighed before being written. The second entry was more troubling. The bank called again. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. Daniel promised he'd take care of it, but he hasn't. When I asked, he got angry, said, I don't understand what he's dealing with. I think he's lying to me. I think he's lying to everyone. Ellison leaned back in his chair. Financial trouble. That was a pressure cooker for a lot of families, but combined with Sarah's tone, it felt like more than just debt. The third entry was the one that made his skin tighten. Someone was outside again last night. I saw him from the upstairs window. Daniel said it was probably nothing, but I could tell he already knew who it was. He wouldn't look at me when I asked. She never mentioned the man's name. Never described him. Just the uneasy certainty that Daniel knew. Ellison flipped to the final entry Emily had provided. Dated October 2nd, 2005, just 3 days before the disappearance. I can't write it down. If anything happens to me, Emily will know what I mean. She'll know what to tell them. Daniel thinks I don't see the way he looks at the door at night. I do. And I hear him whispering downstairs when he thinks I'm asleep. The line "I can't write it down" repeated twice. Darker the second time. As if the pen had pressed harder into the paper, Ellison closed the file and looked at Emily, who was sitting across from him in the small interview room. When she says you'd know what to tell them, what did she mean? Emily's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. Sarah told me Daniel was involved with someone. Not just an affair, something worse. She didn't tell me who. Said it was dangerous, that she'd tell me when she had proof. Did she say anything about the man on the porch? Emily nodded slowly, once. She called him the visitor. Said Daniel didn't want her to talk about him. Ellison leaned forward. Do you think Daniel knew the visitor? I think he brought him there, Emily said flatly. And I think Sarah found out why. Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment she looked as if she might take it back. But she didn't. Back at his desk, Ellison stared at the phrase from the diary, I can't write it down. It was the kind of line that implied the secret was so volatile, so incriminating, that even on paper it felt dangerous. If Daniel was hiding something, a deal, a debt, a threat, and if the man on the porch was part of it, then the disappearance wasn't random. It was deliberate. In the Whitmore bedroom, photographed the night of the disappearance, there had been no diary, no hidden letters, no scribbled notes, nothing to suggest Sarah had been documenting her fears, which meant she'd kept them elsewhere, or someone had taken them. The thought gnawed at him. Morels appeared in the doorway. You're going to want to see this. She handed him a printed report from the bank records. Daniel had withdrawn $8,000 in cash 2 weeks before the disappearance. No trace of where it went. And there's more, Morales added. 2 days before they vanished, he bought a large fireproof safe from a hardware store. We didn't find it in the house. Ellison's mind flashed to the diary entries, the unspoken secret. A safe big enough to hide documents, or something else. That evening, Ellison drove to Emily's small apartment to return the copies. The original diary lay on the coffee table, untouched. If she was scared, Ellison asked, why didn't she leave? Emily's eyes softened. Because she loved him. Because she thought she could fix it. And because of the kids, she'd never take them away from their father unless she had no choice. When Ellison left, the street outside was quiet. The kind of quiet that made him uneasy. He glanced once toward the shadows between the parked cars, half expecting to see a tall, thin man watching. But there was nothing. Back at the station, he reopened the manila folder and read the October 2nd entry again. I hear him whispering downstairs. When he thinks I'm asleep, the detail struck him differently this time. Whispers, not talking, not arguing, whispers. The kind people use when they don't want others to hear. And that meant there was someone else in the house. The rain had eased by the time Detective Mark Ellison returned to the Whitmore house. The October air smelled faintly of wet leaves and cold metal, the kind of scent that made crime scenes feel sharper, more intrusive. He stepped inside again. The familiar creak of the foyer floorboards breaking the silence. He had been over these rooms more times than he could count. Yet the house never lost its oppressive stillness. The air was stale, carrying the ghost of a meal that would never be eaten. It was during a final sweep of the living room that Ellison noticed the faint curl of ash inside the brick fireplace. A half-burned sheet lay buried beneath cold, grey embers, paper edges, blackened, but the middle still legible. Whoever tried to destroy it had stopped halfway or been interrupted. He knelt, lifting it carefully with gloved hands. The ink was smeared in places, but the handwriting was delicate, deliberate. "See, I never wanted it to go this far. You promised no one would get hurt. We had an agreement. Daniel can never find out about us, or the deal. If he does, everything falls apart. Please, meet me at the old pier tonight. I'll explain everything. If you don't show, I'll have no choice but to tell the truth." Ellison's eyes paused at the signature, but there was none. Just a final jagged ink mark where the pen had clearly been pulled away too quickly. The letter was a bombshell. If Sarah had written it, it meant she was hiding an affair and something else. A deal gone wrong. Not a phrase people used lightly. He read it again, focusing on that single initial. C. It could be a first name, a last name, or even a nickname. But the tone urgent, desperate told him this wasn't casual correspondence. Ellison slipped the letter into an evident sleeve. He tried to picture Sarah writing it, maybe late at night, kitchen light on, the rest of the house asleep. He imagined her glancing toward the stairs, afraid of Daniel overhearing, the pen shaking in her hand. Then the scrape of footsteps. Outside the window, the decision to burn it. And then, Ellison, the voice broke the quiet. It was Officer Lena Torres, still combing through the upstairs rooms. "You're going to want to see this." She led him into the master bedroom. The bed was unmade, a suitcase half-packed on the floor, women's clothes neatly folded inside. A child's stuffed rabbit tucked between them. But it wasn't the suitcase that drew Ellison's attention. It was the open drawer of the nightstand. Inside lay a stack of unopened bills, some marked final notice in red, others from unfamiliar creditors. And tucked beneath them, a photo. Sarah stood smiling beside a man who was most definitely not Daniel. His arm was around her shoulders, their faces close enough to suggest intimacy. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-creased skin and a toothy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. On the back, in looping handwriting to S4, "When you need to remember us." C. Ellison exhaled slowly. Now the letter had a face. "This guy's our C," Torres said quietly. "Maybe," Ellison replied. "Or maybe, that's exactly what someone wants us to think." They bagged the photo and the bills, the suitcase, even the stuffed rabbit. Every detail painted a more complicated picture of the Whitmores. On paper, they were a struggling but ordinary family. In reality, there were fractures, money problems, marital tension, and now a secret lover tied to a mysterious deal. Ellison's mind kept circling back to the night of October 14th, the last night anyone heard from them. If Sarah had planned to meet this C at the pier, had she gone there before the call to 911? Or had something happened between writing the letter and dialing the phone? Back downstairs, he lingered in the living room, staring at the cold fireplace. He tried to see the scene as it had been hours before they vanished. The smell of dinner, the low hum of a TV, Sarah maybe pacing with her phone. Daniel, watching from the kitchen doorway, and outside, somewhere in the rain, someone waiting. The thought sent a ripple of unease through him. If the stranger neighbors had reported, the one who sat on the porch steps at night was C, then this was more than an affair. It was surveillance. It was intimidation. The half-burned letter wasn't just a clue. It was a clock ticking toward something Sarah feared was inevitable. As Ellison zipped his coat and prepared to leave, Torres called after him. "Where do we start?" "Track the guy in the photo." "Not yet," Ellison said. "First, we find the old pier." The name was too specific to ignore. If the pier still existed, it might hold answers, or at the very least, confirmation that Sarah had tried to meet someone there. But in the back of his mind, Ellison knew something darker was brewing. People in dangerous deals didn't just disappear cleanly. They left messes, and the Whitmore house was beginning to feel less like the crime scene and more like the first breadcrumb on a trail that could twist into anything. Outside, the clouds had returned, the wind rattling bare branches along the driveway. The Whitmore's car sat exactly where it had been found, no sign of struggle, no sign of use. Ellison paused at the mailbox before leaving. Inside, tucked among junk flyers and bills, was a postcard. No return address. Just a single word, scrawled in black marker. Soon. His pulse tightened. The pier could wait. The ash from the half-burned letter still lingered in Detective Mark Ellison's mind long after the fireplace had been swept clean. The handwriting, the cryptic tone, and that single initial C felt like a key that refused to turn in the lock. But by early 2006, the trail had cooled to a chill that seeped into his bones. The Whitmore residence was now silent in the way abandoned places are, not merely empty, but hollow. Boards covered the windows to deter curious trespassers, though a few local teens had already claimed it as a haunted dare spot. Grass grew long and wild, swallowing the pathway to the front steps where the mysterious stranger once sat. At the station, the case file grew thicker, but not deeper. Leads arrived in bursts, each one promising a breakthrough and dying before it could draw breath. A woman swore she saw Daniel Whitmore buying groceries in a neighboring county. Surveillance proved otherwise. A hunter claimed to have found bones in the woods. They belonged to a deer. And then there were the calls. Anonymous, short, always in the late hours. Ellison picked up every time, and every time, silence answered him. By March, the photos once pinned high on the active cases board had been shifted lower, their edges curling. The other detectives stopped asking about them, unless they wanted to tease Ellison for nursing a ghost. Mark, some people don't want to be found, his partner, Officer Ray Delaney, said one morning over coffee. Ellison didn't respond. He'd heard the theory too many times that the Whitmores had vanished of their own choosing, escaping debt or scandal. But Sarah's last call, the shaking in her voice, was not the sound of someone ready to walk away. The town's gossip evolved like a living organism. One version claimed Daniel had been running drugs through the local docks and owed the wrong people money. Another whispered that Sarah had rekindled a relationship with a high school sweetheart, perhaps, and the two lovers had staged the disappearance. There was even talk that the entire family lay buried beneath the very foundation of the house, victims of some horrific pact. Ellison hated the speculation, but he understood it. When answers are absent, people build their own. By summer, the case went officially cold. No new leads, no forensic breakthroughs, no sightings worth the ink it took to log them. Ellison continued his own quiet investigation, combing through old case notes on nights when the station emptied out. He reread Sarah's sister's diary entries, dissected every line of the half-burned letter, and stared at aerial maps of the surrounding area until his eyes blurred. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the station windows, he reopened the photo set taken the night of October 14, 2005. The night the Whitmores vanished. He noticed something he'd overlooked before, in the picture of the front porch, a faint smudge against the wood railing. It could have been dirt, or it could have been something else entirely. He sent the image to the lab for enhancement, but weeks later, the report came back inconclusive. Another dead-end. Time moved on. For everyone else, the Whitmore Children's School removed their names from the attendance list. Their church stopped mentioning them in Sunday prayers. The house was quietly sold at auction, purchased by a real estate investor who never moved in. For Ellison, though, the absence remained sharp. He'd drive past the property sometimes, parking a block away to avoid drawing attention, and sit. With the engine off, the house stood like a sealed vault, holding secrets just out of reach. One cold November evening, nearly a year after the disappearance, Ellison found himself at the Iron Lantern, a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where locals with too much to drink and too little to lose sometimes let slip things they shouldn't. He overheard two older men at the far end of the bar. One leaned in close to the other, speaking in a low voice, told him not to use that damn chimney, the man said. The other laughed. Yeah, well, didn't matter in the end. They're gone, aren't they? The words lodged in Ellison's mind like a splinter. Chimney, He approached them casually, flashing his badge. The conversation evaporated. Both men claimed they'd been talking about a buddy's hunting cabin. Their eyes said otherwise, but without more, Ellison couldn't press. Still, the fragment of that conversation would stay with him for years. By the second anniversary, even Ellison's superiors had given up hope. "Some things you've got to let go," the chief told him during an end-of-year review. Ellison nodded, but didn't agree. Letting go wasn't in his nature. The case sat untouched. For the better part of a decade, files were boxed. Evidence was shelved. And in the basement archives, the Whitmore's folder collected dust thicker than the paper itself. But the story wasn't over. It was April 2017 when the call came. Ellison, older now and worn at the edges, was halfway through a lukewarm cup of coffee when the desk sergeant said, "You're not going to believe this. Some contractors tearing down the old Whitmore place, and they found something in the chimney." Ellison froze. 12 years had passed since Sarah's trembling voice filled his ear. 12 years since the stranger on the porch, the half-burnt letter, and the rumors that never stopped swirling. He set the coffee down slowly, feeling the weight of the moment press into him. "Tell them not to touch a damn thing," he said, reaching for his coat. The drive to the property felt shorter than it had any right to. The house looked even smaller than he remembered, its boarded windows like closed eyes. Police tape fluttered in the wind. Inside, a crew stood pale-faced near the hearth. The bricks above the mantel had been partially removed, revealing a narrow, blackened shaft. Ellison stepped closer, and the air turned colder, heavier. From within the darkness of the chimney came a smell, faint, metallic, and unmistakable. The case wasn't cold anymore. By 2017, the Whitmore case was a ghost story. A faded newspaper clipping tacked to a corkboard at the police station. An occasional hushed mention over coffee at the diner. Detective Mark Ellison had retired. His files boxed up and collecting dust in a basement archive. But on an unremarkable Tuesday morning in late September, Detective Claire Hanlon's inbox pinged with an anonymous email. The subject line was, "Nothing more than 12 years is long enough." The body of the message was shorter still. "Look inside the chimney, no name, no sender traceable." Just that single unnerving sentence. Hanlon read it twice, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She knew the Whitmore case in broad strokes, the vanishing family that had haunted this quiet New Hampshire town. But look inside the chimney. That was specific. Too specific to be a prank, that she pulled the case file from archives. The photographs were as eerie as she'd heard, a half-finished dinner. Sarah's wine glass still half full, a child's jacket draped over a chair. The official reports described a search of the home, but nothing about the chimney beyond a cursory visual check. Hanlon didn't believe in coincidence. She drove out to the Whitmore house that afternoon. The property had changed hands twice since 2005. The current owners, an older couple named Kearns, were more than willing to let her take a look, though Mrs. Kearns admitted she hated the place. "It's drafty," she said, hesitating at the threshold. "You'll see." Inside, the living room still had the original brick fireplace. The hearth was clean, the brick soot darkened by years of use. Hanlon crouched down, shining her flashlight inside. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed a faint, jagged seam along one interior brick, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. She tapped it hollow. Her pulse quickened. She called in a department mason to carefully remove the section without damaging the structure. It took less than 20 minutes to reveal a small rusted metal box wedged deep in the recess. Inside the box was a single photograph. It showed Daniel Whitmore standing beside a man in a contractor's uniform, his arm slung casually around the man's shoulder. Both were smiling, but not with their eyes. On the back, in faint blue ink, was scrawled C and D. "Job well done." Hanlon's mind locked on the letter C. She went straight to the property records from 2005. There, under the permits for structural modifications to the Whitmore home, was a name, Carlton Briggs, listed as the contractor hired just 2 weeks before the disappearance. No prior mention of him appeared in the original investigation notes. That alone set her teeth on edge. She dug deeper. Briggs' business had shut down in 2008, and his address history was scattered 3 states, multiple aliases. Yet something about his name tugged at her instincts. At her desk that night, she cross-referenced every known associate of Daniel Whitmore. There was no formal link to Briggs except for one irregularity: a withdrawal of $15,000 from the Whitmore's joint account, dated exactly 1 day after the contractor permit was filed. The funds were never traced. Claire leaned back in her chair. If Sarah's half-burned letter had been addressed to C, could it have been this Carlton? And if so, what deal had gone wrong? The next morning, Hanlon tracked Briggs' last known location to a rundown mobile home park in Vermont. The park manager told her Briggs had moved out years ago but had been a quiet tenant, except for one night in 2007 when police were called for a domestic disturbance. No charges had been filed. She asked the manager if he still had Briggs' rental application. He did. There was a phone number, long disconnected, and an emergency contact. Daniel Whitmore. Hanlon felt the floor shift beneath her in the space of 24 hours. The coldest case in the county had cracked open, not with answers, but with a thread. And threads, if pulled long enough, had a way of unraveling everything. Before leaving the park, she called Ellison. He sounded tired, older, but his voice sharpened the moment she said the name. Carlton Briggs, she repeated. Ellison's pause on the line was telling. That name came up once, he said slowly. Daniel mentioned him when we were discussing repairs to the chimney. I followed up, but Briggs was hard to pin down. Then other leads came in, and he exhaled. I let it slide. You think he was the intruder Sarah called about? Hanlon asked. I think, Ellison said, you just found the shadow on the porch. That night, Hanlon returned to the Whitmore property alone. She stood before the chimney in the darkened living room, the rusted box on the mantel, the photograph. Staring back at her, she imagined Daniel and Briggs working side by side, their hands blackened with soot. Laughter echoing in the house, Sarah would later fear. She thought about Sarah's trembling voice on the 911 tape. He's been here before, and Hanlon knew that. He might not have been a stranger at all. The next step was clear. Find Briggs. But she also knew that digging into a man like that after 12 years wasn't just about uncovering the past, it was about stepping into its teeth. She picked up her phone and dialed an old contact in Vermont State Police. I'm looking for a man, she said, and I think he's been hiding in plain sight. Outside, the October wind rattled the bare branches against the roof. Somewhere, far from this quiet street, a man named Carlton Briggs might have heard the same wind and felt that same uneasy prickle down his spine, because after 12 years, the game had started again, and this time, the chimney wasn't hiding his secret anymore. Rain spattered against the police van's windshield as Detective Claire Hanlon stood in the Whitmore driveway, staring at the skeletal outline of the old house. The property had been boarded up for over a decade, a grim landmark in the quiet town of Maple Hollow. The anonymous tip, "Look inside the chimney," had been echoing in her head ever since she traced C to Christopher Vale, the contractor Daniel Whitmore had hired shortly before the family vanished. The forensics team was already at work. The chimney, tall and narrow, rose from the center of the house like a stubborn monument. Its base was sealed over with uneven bricks, the mortar a slightly different shade from the rest. Newer, Claire noted detective. One of the forensic techs called from inside the living room. This isn't original work. These bricks were added later. Crude job, too. Claire pulled on her gloves and stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with mold and old dust. The living room was frozen in 2005. Faded curtains still hung over dirty windows. A coffee table stood where it had always been, and the faint outline of a rug marked the wooden floor where furniture once sat. The chimney dominated the room. She crouched near its base, tracing the line where the newer bricks met the original structure. How long will it take? She asked. Depends on what's behind it, the tech replied, prying at the mortar with a chisel. with each brick removed. The smell grew stronger, not the sharp, fresh tang of decay, but the deep, earthy musk of something long hidden. Claire's stomach tightened. She had been on enough scenes to recognize the scent of human remains. By the time the opening was large enough for the tech to shine a light inside, the room had gone silent. Claire leaned forward, peering into the darkness. Something pale reflected. The beam, bones, the tech whispered. The first few were small, fragile ribs. The curved arc of a skull, no bigger than a grapefruit. Claire felt her throat constrict. Then, deeper inside, larger bones appeared, tangled in a way that seemed impossible for nature to arrange. They worked in slow, deliberate movements, pulling each piece into the light, placing it on sterile sheets. 2 adult skeletons. 2 children. Every one of them compressed in an unnatural posture, knees tucked tightly to chests, heads bent forward, as if folded into themselves. Claire stepped back, her breath uneven. "This isn't just concealment," she murmured. "It's deliberate." The coroner, Dr. Patel, arrived within the hour, kneeling beside the remains. Positioning like this, it's either post-mortem manipulation or they were placed while still alive. He paused, frowning. Given the chimney's dimensions, if they were alive, they wouldn't have lasted more than minutes. Claire felt a cold sweat slide down her back. The thought of the family's final moments pressed in like the walls of that chimney. Outside, crime scene tape fluttered in the wind as the news began to spread. A neighbor, Mrs. Rollins, stood at the edge of the lawn, clutching her coat. "We always knew something bad happened in there," she told an officer. "But the chimney, God help us." Claire overheard and turned to the officer. "No one else goes inside until we finish." Her voice was sharper than intended, but the case had just shifted from a cold file to an active homicide scene. As the bones were carried out, Claire noticed something odd. A small rusted chain tangled around one of the adult femurs. A pendant hung from it, caked in soot. She took it in her gloved hand, rubbing away the grime until a tiny engraved letter emerged. C. She froze. The same letter as on the half-burned note from 2005. The same initial as Christopher Vale. "Get this, to evidence," she told the nearest tech. "I want prints. I want metal composition. I want everything." Patel stood, removing his mask. "Time of death will be hard to pin exactly. But given the preservation in the chimney and the state of the bones, I'd place it very close to the night they disappeared." Claire nodded slowly. It fit the frantic 911 call. The unlocked door, dinner left untouched. But it didn't answer the bigger question: why the chimney? By evening, the remains had been transported to the lab. The house felt even emptier. Now, its secrets partially exhumed, yet still shrouded in shadow. Claire lingered by the hearth, running her hand along the soot-stained brick. Somewhere in the story of that night, this chimney had become both tomb and silence. She turned to leave, but her flashlight beam caught something just above the opening. A faint scratch, almost invisible beneath the blackened stone. She leaned closer. Letters, 4 of them, etched shallow, but clear enough under the right light. HLP. Her pulse quickened. She photographed the marks, then traced them with her fingertip. The grooves felt desperate, uneven, carved by someone with little time or space in her mind. The image formed. The Whitmore family, forced into the chimney. One of them clawing at the bricks in a final, hopeless plea. The weight of the case settled on her shoulders. This wasn't a break in the investigation. It was a floodgate. Whoever C was, he had been here. He had been inside this house after the last call, that as she stepped into the damp night air, Claire knew the next step. They had a body count, they had a crime scene, and they had a name. But what they didn't have yet, and what she needed most, was the truth about Christopher Vale. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low, pressing against the rooftops like a heavy lid. Somewhere out there, Claire thought, C might still be alive. And if he was, he had been living with the knowledge of what lay inside this chimney for 12 long years. She got into her car, the pendant in an evidence bag on the seat beside. Her phone buzzed, a text from the lab. We found something else in the chimney debris. Call us. She started the engine, heart pounding. Rain streaked the station's windows in thin, shimmering lines as Detective Claire Hanlon spread the Whitmore case file across her desk. The edges of the old folders were frayed, their manila color faded to a jaundiced yellow. For 12 years, these documents had been stored in the evidence archive, gathering dust while the truth rotted alongside the remains in that sealed chimney. The forensics report lay open before her. The bones told a timeline no one had dared to imagine. Sarah, Daniel, and the children had all died within hours of each other. But the unnatural positioning of the bodies hinted at something more than a simple act of violence. It was ritualistic, deliberate. Whoever had done it hadn't just hidden them. They had arranged them. Claire leaned back, letting the cold hum of the stations overhead light settle in the silence. If C was truly the contractor Daniel hired, he hadn't just been there to build something, he had been there to seal the family's tomb. She began reading through the original witness statements again, line by line. They were filled with the kind of small-town chatter she'd grown used to: half-truths, outright lies, and a fog of convenient forgetfulness. But, as she cross-referenced each statement against another, contradictions began to flicker like sparks in the dark. A neighbor swore she had last seen Sarah on the afternoon of October 10th, but another said she saw her through the kitchen window. The following night, a teenager claimed he saw a tall man leaving the Whitmore's porch 2 days before the disappearance. But his best friend insisted it was just Daniel, looking stressed. Claire knew better. Witnesses in cold cases often lied, not always to protect the guilty, but sometimes to shield themselves from involvement, from gossip, from the sharp teeth of suspicion. But here, the pattern was too thick, too tangled, too random. The name that kept surfacing in her notes was Laura Bishop, Sarah's best friend. Laura had been among the first questioned back in 2005. Her statement was short, almost suspiciously neat. I saw Sarah the day before she went missing. She seemed fine. We didn't talk about anything important. Claire stared at the words, then dug through the archived audio interviews. She found Laura's tape, pressed play, and listened. Laura's voice trembled slightly, not the grief-stricken kind of tremble, but the kind that comes when someone is thinking too carefully about what to say. No, Laura had told Detective Ellison. I don't know anyone named C. Claire paused the tape, her jaw tightening. Laura had denied knowing C before Claire even mentioned the name in this interview. That was a red flag. 2 days later, Claire sat across from Laura in a quiet coffee shop just outside town. Laura was older now, her hair threaded with silver, but her eyes still darted nervously, as if she feared being seen. You wanted to talk about Sarah? Laura asked. Her hands wrapped too tightly around her cup. I wanted to talk about the truth, Claire said. About what you didn't tell the police in 2005. Laura stiffened. I told them everything I knew. No, Claire said, leaning forward. You told them everything you wanted them to know. You said you didn't know anyone named C. That wasn't true, was it? Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. Why does it matter now? They're gone. It matters because someone put them in that chimney, Claire said, her voice low. Someone you know. For a long moment, Laura didn't speak. Then, with a sigh that seemed to collapse years of silence, she said, C wasn't just some random man, he was Christopher Hale. She stopped herself. He was someone Sarah shouldn't have been involved with. Claire felt the air tighten between them. Involved how? Laura shook her head. It started small. Daniel had money problems, bad ones. Christopher was connected. He could get money fast, no questions asked. Sarah told me they made a deal. But then she said Christopher wanted something else in return, something she wasn't willing to give. Claire's pen hovered over her notebook. And what was that? Laura looked out the window, eyes glossy with unspilled tears. She never told me. She just said it wasn't worth dying for. The weight of the words pressed into Claire's chest. Did Daniel know about Christopher? Laura gave a bitter laugh. Daniel introduced them. Claire's mind raced. A contractor, A man tied to the husband's financial trouble, a deal gone wrong, and a family that ended up bricked into their own chimney. Why didn't you tell Ellison any of this? Claire asked. Because Christopher wasn't just dangerous, he had people. I thought if I kept quiet, it would keep me alive. Claire studied her for a moment, noting the slight tremor in her hands. Fear that had lived for over a decade didn't vanish easily. When she returned to the station, Claire pulled Christopher Hale's file from the county archives. He had a criminal record fraud, extortion, suspected involvement in 2 disappearances in neighboring towns, but no convictions. He had vanished in late 2006, just a year after the Whitmores disappeared. She found a photograph from a 2004 construction permit application, a tall man with a lean build, sharp jaw, and a faint scar over his left eyebrow. It was the same scar described by the teenager who claimed to see the stranger on the Whitmores' porch. Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the photo. If Hale had killed the Whitmores, why seal them inside the chimney instead of disposing of the bodies elsewhere? It was theatrical, symbolic, maybe even a warning. The problem was, the dead can't or canned. Christopher Hale had become a ghost of his own making. Still, the pieces were shifting. Lies were crumbling. And somewhere in that heap of ashes, the truth was waiting to be pulled free. Claire closed the file slowly. The rain still tapping the station windows like impatient fingers. Tomorrow, she would track down the last known address for Christopher Hale. If he was alive, she would find him. And if he was dead, someone would know where he was buried. For now, she pinned his photograph to the evidence board, a single red string stretching from his image to the photo of the Whitmore chimney. 2 images. One truth, the interrogation room smelled faintly of stale coffee and old linoleum. Claire Hanlon sat across from the man they had hunted for weeks. Carl Redding. Time had not been kind to him. His shoulders were stooped, his face carved with deep lines, his fingernails yellowed and uneven. He stared at the table like the grain in the wood could tell him what to say. Carl, Claire began, her tone even but edged. You know why you're here. He gave a slow, tired nod. The Whitmores. His voice was rough, as if disuse had left it brittle. You knew Daniel. You worked on his house, she pressed. I did, he said simply. His eyes flickered briefly to hers, then away. He called me, said the house needed work. Truth is, he just needed me. Claire leaned forward. Needed you for what? Carl's lips tightened. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, he said, to hide them. Claire stilled. Hide who? He gave her a look, a mix of pity and exhaustion. His family, Sarah, the kids, said things had gotten bad between them. Real bad. That night, they fought. He told me he'd lost control, but he swore they weren't dead, said they needed to disappear. Her pen hovered above her notebook. Disappear, how? I asked the same thing, Carl muttered. He said he had a plan, but he needed somewhere no one would ever think to look. I told him I could help seal off spaces in the house. Places you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for them. He rubbed his temple. I never saw the family again after that night. Claire's jaw tightened. So you're telling me you didn't kill them? Carl's gaze was steady now, almost defiant. No, I didn't kill them. I helped him hide something, but not bodies. I swear it. When I left, he said they'd be safe. That's all I knew. She felt the lie, or at least the omission, in every syllable. Then why didn't you come forward when they went missing? Carl's voice cracked. Because I was scared. Daniel wasn't the man people thought he was. He had people. Friends who didn't ask questions but knew how to make problems disappear. He exhaled shakily. I figured if I spoke, I'd be next. Claire's mind churned. His words didn't fit neatly with the evidence, especially the bones found in the chimney. Carl, the remains we found, they were. The Whitmores were sure. He flinched. Then something happened after I left. His voice grew hoarse. Or maybe, it was all a lie from the start. Silence filled the room, heavy as wet concrete. Claire studied him, searching for cracks in his story. His hands trembled, but not like a guilty man's, more like someone who had carried a burden too long. Still, there was something else in his eyes, a shadow he wouldn't name. "Carl," she said carefully, "you told me you sealed spaces in the house. Were there other hiding places besides the chimney?" He looked away. "Not places you'd think to check. What does that mean?" He leaned forward now, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The truth is still in that house, detective, not in the ground, not in some police file. In the walls, the floors, the air itself. That place remembers." Claire's skin prickled. "What exactly am I supposed to find?" Carl only shook his head. "You'll know when you hear it." "Hear it," she echoed. He offered a thin, haunted smile. "Houses talk, detective, you just have to listen." Before she could press further, he leaned back and folded his arms. The shift was instant, the wall between them snapping back into place. She recognized the look. He'd decided he'd said enough. The next hour was a grind of repeated questions and the same careful answers. Carl would not elaborate on Daniel's people, nor on the supposed plan to hide the family. His lawyer arrived and shut the conversation down entirely. Claire stepped out into the hallway. The air outside the interrogation room tasting sharper, freer. Mark Ellison, long since retired from active duty, but still attached to the case, waited for her, leaning on his cane. His face was unreadable. "Well," he asked. "He says he didn't kill them. Claims he was just helping Daniel hide them," she replied. Mark's brow furrowed. "And you believe that?" She hesitated. "I believe he believes it. But something's missing." He kept circling back to the house. "Like it's holding some secret we still haven't found." Mark gave a humorless chuckle. "That house has been searched a dozen times over." Claire's gaze drifted toward the evidence room, where photographs of the Whitmore home lay in files. "Not by me," she said quietly. Mark studied her a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time you did." That night, she drove past the Whitmore property. The house sat in shadow, its windows blank and lifeless. Yet, in the shifting glow of her headlights, she swore she saw a figure on the porch, still silent. Watching when she blinked, it was gone, but the feeling wasn't. The old wood seemed to hum under the wind, as if remembering footsteps that no longer fell there. Claire sat in her car, engine idling, heart pounding in her throat. Carl's words echoed in her mind. "Houses talk." She killed the engine. If the truth was still in that house, she was going to hear it. The afternoon light in the Whitmore house was muted, filtered through grime-streaked curtains that hadn't been touched in over a decade. Detective Claire Hanlon stood in the living room, her boots planted on the warped wooden floorboards, staring at the chimney like it might blink first. Carl Redding's words still echoed in her head. The truth is still in that house. The forensic crew had already gutted most of the chimney to retrieve the remains, but Claire's instincts told her there was more. The bricks were uneven, with mortar in some places fresher than in others. One small section, near the base, looked almost deliberate, like someone had tried to patch it in a hurry. "Take it apart," she ordered. 2 technicians knelt with chisels and mallets. The sound of metal on stone ringing through the hollow, empty home. As the bricks came loose, a stale, suffocating smell rushed out. Dust, soot, and something older, more unsettling. A flashlight beam caught the outline of something black and rectangular wedged deep in the cavity. "Phone," one of the techs murmured. It was caked in ash, its plastic warped slightly from heat. The screen was cracked, but it was unmistakably a flip phone from the mid-2000s. Claire took it in gloved hands, the weight of it sending a ripple of unease down her spine. "Bag it. Priority evidence," she said. Back at the mobile lab parked outside, the tech team worked in tense silence. After an hour of careful cleaning, they managed to connect the phone to a power source. The screen flickered, sputtered, then came to life in a dull green glow. The phone had almost nothing on it. No recent calls, no photos, no messages. But there was one saved voicemail. Claire leaned closer as the tech pressed play, static, a low hum. Then, suddenly, Daniel Whitmore's Voice, sharp and ragged. Sarah, stop, just stop. There was a scuffle, the sound of something heavy hitting wood. Sarah's voice followed, high-pitched and desperate. The kid's Daniel, no. A child screamed in the background, the sound thin and terrified. Then came a muffled series of thuds, as though something or someone was being dragged. The next noise was unmistakable, the scrape of bricks being stacked, mortar being spread. It went on for several seconds. Daniel muttered something inaudible, his tone flat and mechanical. Sarah's voice cut in again, but it was faint now, as if coming from the other side of a wall. The last sound was a hollow slam, followed by silence. Claire realized she'd been holding her breath. That's it, the tech said quietly. The voicemail cuts off there. No timestamp, but based on the phone model and data, it's from October 2005. Claire sat back, her pulse pounding in her ears. This was no longer just a disappearance, it was murder. And yet, Carl Redding had insisted he didn't kill them. If Daniel had done this, why would Carl's hands be anywhere near the bricks? Something didn't line up. She called the DA's office, relaying the discovery. Within hours, the house was swarming again, crime scene tape stretched taut. Neighbors watching from behind their curtains like it was 2005 all over again. Claire returned to the chimney, tracing the edges of the hidden compartment. There was still an odd, narrow gap behind where the phone had been. She slid her hand inside and felt something cold and metallic. She pulled out a small, rusted key. No tags, no markings, but it was too deliberately placed to be random. Back. This too, she said. The forensic pathologist stepped in, mask still in place. Detective, you might want to see this, he said, motioning toward the back of the chimney structure. We found tool marks. Someone chiseled into this after the original bricks were laid. Not during construction. Meaning someone had come back, months or years later, to hide the phone and possibly the key. Claire's mind spun. Had Carl returned here after the murders? Or had someone else, someone still unaccounted for, made sure these clues stayed hidden? Outside, the October wind carried the scent of rain, just like the night Sarah had made her last call. The neighbors' houses loomed in the grey light, unchanged in 12 years. Claire wondered how many of them had seen something back then, and how many had chosen silence. That as she walked toward her car, the phone's audio replayed in her mind. The dragging, the screams, the bricks. She had heard fear before, in cases. But there had been something else in Sarah's voice, not just terror, but betrayal. Claire looked at the key in the evidence bag. Its teeth were worn, its shape old-fashioned. It didn't match any locks in the Whitmore home, which meant it belonged somewhere else, somewhere Daniel or Sarah had thought was important enough to keep hidden, even as everything fell apart. She slid into the driver's seat and made mental note. Check Daniel Whitmore's old business, addresses, storage units, and any properties tied to C. If Carl Redding was telling the truth, then maybe Daniel hadn't acted alone. Maybe the deal gone wrong from the burned letter had exploded into something darker, something that had swallowed the entire family. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from the lab. We recovered partial fingerprints from inside the chimney compartment. Not Carl's, not Daniel's. Claire's grip on the steering wheel tightened. There was a third person, and if they had been careful enough to erase themselves from the original investigation, they might still be out there. She glanced back at the Whitmore house in the rearview mirror. Its windows reflected nothing but grey sky, its front porch sagging under the weight of years. Somewhere inside, the echoes of that night were still trapped, waiting to be heard. Claire knew the next step wasn't just about following evidence, it was about forcing the past into the light, no matter who tried to keep it buried, and the key in her possession. That was the first door she planned to open. The audio from Sarah's phone ended in that suffocating silence. The kind that doesn't fade, but hangs heavy in the air. Detective Claire Hanlon sat alone in the evidence room, headphones pressed tightly to her ears, eyes fixed on the digital readout, as though watching for something that could change the inevitable. There was no change, no miracle. Only the faint, almost imperceptible hiss at the end of the recording, the last breath of a dying battery and, perhaps, of the Whitmore family. Claire exhaled and pushed back from the desk. Her notes, spread in a chaotic fan across the table, told the story no one wanted to believe. Sarah Whitmore had died that night in 2005. Killed by Daniel Whitmore during an argument that turned violent. Carl Redding, C., had been the handyman, the one Daniel trusted enough to ask for the unthinkable. Carl's version of events painted him as a reluctant accomplice, a man paid in desperation and silence, but it was what he admitted, in passing, almost as an afterthought, that chilled Claire the most. The kids, they were crying when we started sealing it up, he'd said. His eyes fixed on the floor. Claire hadn't needed him to explain further. The forensics had already shown that the children's cause of death wasn't blunt force trauma or a weapon, it was ASPHYXIATION. Now, standing in the Whitmore house for the first time since the chimney had been opened, Claire felt the space pressing in on her. The rooms were stripped bare, the carpets pulled up, the walls patched with mismatched plaster. Even the smell was wrong, not the musty scent of abandonment, but the sharp tang of disinfectant, as though someone had tried to erase more than just stains. The chimney stood in the center of the living room, like an unwanted monument. Its bricks had been replaced, the forensic team's handiwork almost too precise to clean. Yet to Claire, it still looked wrong. As if the house itself remembered. She walked slowly around it, fingertips grazing the mortar lines. The weight of what had happened here seemed to hum beneath her skin. She could almost hear the faint echo of small hands pounding against brick, muffled by layers of clay and stone. "Why did you do it, Daniel?" she whispered, though the man was long gone, dead of a car accident in 2009, his body buried under a headstone that simply read, "Beloved husband and father." Claire's phone buzzed. It was an email from the county archives. The full transcripts of Sarah's sister's diary entries that had been withheld from the original case. She opened the attachment, scanning for anything new. One entry, dated a week before the disappearance, stopped her cold. "Sarah says he's been talking to the man in the yard again. Says it's not safe for the kids. I told her to leave, but she just shook her head and said it was already too late." Claire frowned. The man in the yard. Carl hadn't mentioned being in the yard before the night of the disappearance. In fact, he'd claimed he hadn't been near the house in weeks. Something wasn't adding up. She left the living room and stepped onto the porch. The rain had started again, soft and steady, just like that October night, 12 years ago. Across the street, an elderly neighbor, the same one who'd spoken to Detective Ellison in 2005, was sweeping leaves from her steps. Claire crossed over. "Mrs. Palmer?" she asked. The woman looked up, her eyes clouded with cataracts, but still sharp in their own way. "You're the new detective?" Claire nodded. "I wanted to ask. Back then, you told the police about a man who used to sit on the Whitmore's porch." Mrs. Palmer's broom stilled. "Yes, never saw his face clearly, always after dark." "Do you remember if it was Carl Redding?" The old woman shook her head. "Too tall. This one had a limp." Claire's mind flashed back to the crime scene photos, to the missing bricks in the chimney, and the awkward positioning of the bodies. A limp, that was new. Carl hadn't mentioned anyone else being there that night. Back in the house, she sat on the floor in front of the chimney, opening her case notebook. The facts fit together neatly now, almost too neatly. Carl as the hired helper, Daniel as the violent husband, Sarah as the victim. But there was that one nagging question: who was the man with the limp? Claire stared at the mortar lines again. She thought of Carl's cryptic words in the interrogation room. The truth's still in that house? Maybe he hadn't meant in as in the walls. Maybe he'd meant in as in inside the story they'd been told. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, and Claire felt it, the strange sense of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was the weight of a case that still had shadows left unexplored. She closed her notebook, stood, and glanced at the chimney one last time before leaving. The smell of damp brick clung to her clothes as she locked the door behind her. In her car, she pulled up Carl's old employment records. He'd worked construction jobs all over the county, but in 2005, He'd been subcontracted for a project with another man, a bricklayer named Henry Doss. Claire's stomach tightened. Doss had a limp from an old work injury. The rain intensified, streaking the windshield in long blurred lines. Claire turned the key in the ignition, the engine humming to life. This wasn't over. Not for her, not for the Whitmores, and certainly not for the man with the limp.